The first light of morning in Fustat was not loud. It was a whisper. It began in the hush of wind curling over sun-dried brick and stone, brushing gently across the rooftop of the home where Layla slept. The pigeons, still hesitant to rise, cooed softly under the worn beams, while the world below clung to its final breath of night. Layla awoke not to an alarm, but to the warmth of sun stretching slowly across her mat. Her room was simple, a woven mat of date palm leaves, a shelf with a clay jug of water, a single embroidered cloth gifted by her late mother, now carefully folded under her head. There was no luxury, but there was order. And order, Layla believed, brought peace. She sat up with deliberate calm, wrapping her scarf around her head in practiced slow movements. Her breath matched the pace of the world outside, not rushed, never forced. Just as the river Nile did not hurry its course, neither did Layla. Before anything else, she dipped her fingers in the clay bowl of water beside her and brought the coolness to her face. It was not only for cleanliness, it was ritual, a whisper of thanks to the day for coming, a moment to remember her place, neither grand nor forgotten, simply present. In the small servants' courtyard, still touched by shadows, Layla began the morning by stoking the kitchen fire. The house was still quiet. Her mistress, Lady Amina, would not stir for another hour. The family's children were curled in their rooms, dreams undisturbed. Only the cook, old Hannah, shared this silent hour with her, and even she moved with the slowness of age, and the wisdom of knowing haste would not bring dawn any quicker. The fire was reluctant at first. Layla coaxed it patiently, using dry palm fronds and bits of linen too worn for use. Smoke curled around her fingers like a cat in affection, and soon the warm glow of flame replaced the night's coolness. She prepared the breakfast tray with dates, warm flatbread, soft goat cheese, and a small dish of honey. Not for herself. This was for the lady and her eldest daughter. Her own meal would come later and simpler, but she took care with the tray as though it were for a queen. Each piece had its place, each detail mattered, because the quiet pride of a maid was not in wealth or praise, but in grace, in doing a thing well, even when no one was looking. As the scent of warm bread filled the small kitchen, Hannah hummed, a tune from her own girlhood, a song of the desert winds and lost oases. Layla listened but did not speak. The moment was not for words, it was for feeling. She climbed the stone steps to the family quarters with the breakfast tray balanced on her shoulder, one hand steadying it as her feet remembered every crack in the staircase. The house was old, not grand like the palaces of the viziers, but respectable, built with love and care and creaking under the weight of stories untold. Layla paused before entering Lady Amina's room. A soft knock, a waiting breath. Then a gentle entry, her eyes lowered, her steps silent on the rugs. Lady Amina stirred, her eyes meeting Layla's with a look neither cold nor warm, a look born of hierarchy, of familiarity, of days repeating, with subtle change. "Thank you, Layla," she said, voice still laced with sleep. Layla placed the tray and stepped back, waiting until she was dismissed. It was a routine, but not mechanical. There was a dance to every movement, a rhythm set by unseen drums. When she returned to the courtyard, the sun had climbed further, casting long golden arms across the ground. The fig tree rustled in gentle greeting. Layla, still without a bite, crouched beside the water jug and drank deeply, the clay cool against her lips. She allowed herself a moment on the worn stone bench beside the kitchen door. Here, in the softness of morning, she sometimes dreamed. Not of escape or fortune, but of her mother's village, of windmills and goats, of songs sung while crushing herbs. These memories lived quietly inside her, like a secret garden tended in silence. But time was moving now. The city was waking. From the street beyond the wall came the sound of donkeys' hooves, of a child calling out for bread, of a merchant arranging jars on a cart. The perfume of cumin and coriander floated in the breeze. The day had truly begun. Layla stood, brushed the dust from her robe, and stepped back into the rhythm. There would be floors to sweep, children to help dress, sandals to mend, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, a brief hour near the fountain in the garden, where the mosaic tiles held the last of the morning light, and her own reflection smiled back at her with quiet eyes. But for now there was only the next task, and that was enough. The kitchen of the household was never entirely still, even in its quietest moments. It breathed like a slumbering beast, with the slow crackle of embers, and the occasional creak of a wooden spoon against a clay pot. For Layla, it was not a place of labor alone, it was a chamber of transformations. Hannah, the cook, was already at the center of this world. She stood like a tree that had grown from the stone floor itself, her hands dusted with flour, her head wrapped in a faded scarf patterned with blue swirls. She did not command the space with loudness, she simply belonged to it, and the kitchen responded to her in kind. "Come, child," she said, not turning her head. "The lentils need watching." Layla moved to the stove where a blackened pot simmered over the embers. The smell was earthy, spiced with cumin and garlic, with a hint of dried mint. She stirred gently, careful not to scrape the bottom too harshly. Each movement was slow, deliberate, so the pot would not lose its song. The kitchen, though small, held more life than any other room in the house. Baskets of chickpeas waited under shelves. Strings of dried onions swayed near the window. A large ceramic jar held the pickled lemons, preserved months ago by Layla and Hannah together, their hands stained with salt and citrus. As Layla worked, she listened, not only to Hannah, who spoke in half-sentences and humming tunes, but to the space itself, the way the ladle knocked softly against the pot, the shuffle of mice in the far corner, daring to return for a dropped crumb. The occasional thud of something upstairs, a slipper perhaps or a dropped brush, reminding them the family above was awakening. "Salt," Hannah murmured, gesturing with her chin. Layla reached for the small bowl and added a pinch. Hannah tasted the lentils with a wooden spoon, then nodded slowly, approvingly, as if it were not merely a meal but a story they were writing together, one flavor at a time. Today, they would also prepare bread, not the flat, simple, round Layla ate for breakfast, but soft loaves with coriander and sesame seeds meant for the lunch table. Layla loved the feel of the dough, warm and pliable, like clay, but more alive. Kneading it was like coaxing a child into a gentle sleep, firm but kind. As her hands pressed and folded, she let her thoughts wander. She imagined the fields where the grain had grown, perhaps somewhere far upriver, touched by a wind unfamiliar to her. She pictured the farmers waking at dawn, their backs already aching, but their spirits lightened by the smell of morning dew. "Thinking again?" Hannah said, smiling slightly. Layla looked up, caught, and gave a small, shy nod. "Good. It makes the bread softer." They laughed softly, and the moment passed between them like a warm current. By mid-morning, the sun struck the lattice of the high kitchen window, and golden slats of light cut across the floor. Layla dusted a board with flour and began shaping, the loaves placing each on a wide wooden tray. She handled them like newborn animals, gently but with confidence. "Take them to the roof," Hannah said. "Let them rise." The roof was not just a place to dry laundry. It was also where dough rose best, kissed by the sun and watched over by pigeons. Layla climbed the narrow stair with the tray balanced in her arms. The air was different up there, open, touched by the distant sound of the mosque's early calls and the faint clatter of pots from neighboring homes. She placed the tray on a shaded table and stood for a moment, letting the wind tug at her scarf. Below, the city murmured to itself, vendors arranging spices, camels grumbling under load. A distant laugh carried on the breeze. Fustat was not a quiet city, but it had a rhythm, and that rhythm, like Layla's own breath, kept time with the sun. When she returned, the kitchen had shifted. The fire was stronger, the pots more active. Hannah was slicing turnips for pickling, her hands moving with the confidence of 1,000 repetitions. "Take a taste," she said, offering Layla a sliver. It was sour and sharp, with a hint of dill. Layla's face puckered and they both smiled. "Good," Hannah declared. "You'll remember this taste when you're old." There was a kind of prophecy in her words, but no pressure. Just the gentle truth of flavors that marked a life. By the time they cleaned the morning mess, the kitchen was brighter, warmer, more alive. Layla washed dishes in silence, scrubbing gently with sand and water. Her fingers were pruned, but her heart felt calm. The work was steady. The world, at least in this moment, was in balance. She dried her hands on a cloth and looked around the kitchen one last time before stepping out to the hallway. The next tasks awaited: children to dress, floors to sweep, errands to run. But the kitchen for now had given her its gift, a rhythm, a warmth, and a memory to carry into the rest of the day. The corridor that led to the children's rooms was quiet, but not for long. Layla walked with measured steps, carrying a folded stack of freshly aired linens and a small wooden comb. The walls here bore faded paintings, stylized birds and vines, remnants of a time when the house had known newness. Now their colors had softened, like memories mellowed by time. She reached the first room and paused. Inside, Amal and little Tariq were already awake, their voices muffled by the heavy curtain. With a breath drawn slow and steady, Layla entered. The room was a scattered mosaic of childhood, slippers tossed to corners, a doll's foot poking out from beneath a cushion, and a trail of date crumbs leading from the window to the bedding. Sunlight filtered through the lattice, casting dappled shadows across the floor and walls. It looked like a scene from one of the old tales, a world within a world. "Layla," Amal chirped, sitting cross-legged on her cushion. Her hair was a dark storm of curls, half wild from sleep. "I dreamed of a cat with a crown." Layla knelt beside her, smoothing the child's hair with gentle fingers. "Did it speak, this royal cat?" "Oh yes," Amal nodded seriously. "It demanded fish and said I must bow." "Wise cat," Layla said, smiling. She reached for the comb and began gently working through the tangles. Amal winced. More out of habit than pain. Meanwhile, Tariq, only 5 and still wrapped in his blanket like a silkworm in cocoon, peeked from under one eyelid. He made no sound, only watched. His world was quieter, softer. Layla knew his silences were full of thought. "Good morning, young prince," she said softly. Tariq blinked, then nodded, his blanket slipping down slightly as a small hand emerged, holding a toy camel carved from wood. He placed it solemnly in Layla's lap, a silent offering. Layla bowed her head as though accepting a gift from a sultan. "He will guard our fortress while we prepare the morning," she whispered, after helping them dress Amal in a cotton robe with bright embroidery, Tariq in a tunic too large but well-loved. Layla set about gathering their clothes from the floor. She folded each piece neatly, dusted cushions, and swept beneath the low furniture. Dust in this house was like gossip, always returning no matter how often it was chased away. As she worked, Amal followed her like a shadow, babbling about her dream kingdom of cats and cloud ladders. Tariq trailed behind silently, dragging his blanket with one hand, the wooden camel in the other. Layla did not rush them. Children moved like water, sometimes gentle, sometimes wild, but never to be hurried. They paused near the small shelf, where story scrolls were kept. Amal reached for one but knocked another loose. The scroll unrolled slightly at Layla's feet. "What's this one?" Amal asked. Layla picked it up with care. It was an old tale, The Weaver and the Stars. She had read it once, long ago, sitting on the kitchen floor during an hour stolen from chores. "It's about a woman who stitched night skies into her curtains," Layla said softly, smoothing the edge of the scroll. Amal's eyes widened. "Can you read it to us?" "Later," Layla promised. "After lunch, if you've napped well." The children groaned in protest, but Layla knew they loved the ritual of delay. It made the story feel earned. With the room now tidy and the children dressed, she ushered them toward the courtyard where their tutor would greet them. Amal skipped ahead, her energy spilling into every footstep. Tariq paused at the threshold, turning back to glance at Layla. She smiled and he smiled back. A quiet, perfect exchange that said far more than words. Alone again in their room, Layla took a final moment. She ran her fingers over the woven cushion covers, her touch lingering on the places where the fabric had frayed. These were the soft details of a servant's intimacy, knowing the feel of things, the small repairs unnoticed by their owners. She folded the blankets and set them by the door. The scent of rosewater lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the smell of warm dust and sun-heated stone, a smell Layla now associated with peace. In the hallway, she met another maid, younger and nervous-eyed, carrying a basket of sewing. They exchanged a nod, a silent sisterhood formed not by blood, but by shared routine and quiet endurance. As Layla descended toward the laundry alcove, she thought again of the story scroll, the weaver who caught stars in her curtains. She imagined what it would be like just once to stitch light into fabric, to hang it and watch the room glow with moon silver. But her hands were made for different work. And yet, in her own way, she did catch stars, in the way she calmed a child. In the way she remembered where every slipper belonged, in the quiet grace of her presence. She did not need to be in a story to matter. By late morning, the sun had grown bold, casting a brilliance over Fustat that painted every wall and stone with gold. The shadows, once cool and long, had shortened into slivers beneath awnings and trees. It was the hour when the city's rhythm quickened, not hurried, never frantic, but vibrant, pulsing with the business of life. Layla wrapped her robe tighter and secured her scarf, then balanced the empty basket on her hip. Hannah had handed her a short list of things needed for the midday meal: coriander, figs if they were ripe, and fresh bread if the oven market's fire was still steady. The house's wooden gate creaked open with a familiarity that only old hinges could provide, and Layla stepped into the outer world. The street was narrow and uneven, lined with homes built shoulder to shoulder like gossiping neighbors. Overhead, cloth awnings stretched across rooftops, casting dappled shade over passers-by. The scent of city life drifted through the air, dust warmed by the sun, oil from frying dough, and the sharper edge of donkey and camel tracks baked into the road. Children played near a corner well, their sandals slapping stone as they chased one another between stalls. An old woman sat beneath a woven canopy, selling bracelets made from seashells and clay beads. A merchant's parrot squawked from its perch, shouting phrases in half-understood Arabic, causing laughter from a group of boys who lingered nearby. Layla moved with ease. This route was familiar, not merely in the sense of routine, but in the way a song becomes a part of you after being sung for years. Her footsteps avoided every loose stone. Her basket shifted instinctively to avoid bumping shoulders. She knew which corner turned sharply, and which step outside the baker's wall had crumbled just slightly more each week. She passed a spice cellar first, and though she didn't stop, she caught a breath of saffron and dried orange peel. It stirred something in her, a memory of a festival years ago when her mother had braided sweet herbs into her hair. Next was the fabric tent, brilliant with color, bolts of indigo, scarlet, and soft green that fluttered like captured birds in the breeze. The fabric seller, a man with one lazy eye and a laugh too big for the alley, nodded at her. "Looking today, Layla? You'd shine in lapis blue." "I'd shine just as brightly in sackcloth," she replied, smiling. He laughed, not insulted, and returned to smoothing a bolt of linen as if it was silk. The marketplace proper began just beyond the archway of a small mosque. Here the sounds grew louder but not harsh. The call of vendors, the rustle of coins, the low hum of negotiation. Layla entered as one might step into a stream, alert but calm, letting the current guide her. She moved first to the herb stall, where a young girl, perhaps her own age, perhaps older, but worn more harshly by sun and toil, stood with fingers stained green. The coriander, freshly bundled, was laid out beside bunches of wild mint and purple basil. "Only the sweetest this morning," the seller said. Layla leaned in, inhaled. It was true. The scent was bright, almost lemony. She selected a bundle, counted the coppers from the pouch tied beneath her sash, and handed them over without a word. Next came the fig vendor, a man known for arguing over every coin. Layla waited her turn, watching a crow peck at a discarded pit nearby. When her turn came, the man narrowed his eyes at her. "Yours always ask for the softest," he grumbled. "And you always keep them behind your basket," she answered, folding her arms lightly. He chuckled and passed her a small sack. "Take these. If they're not good, come shout at me tomorrow." Layla smiled, her thanks spoken not with words but with the slight bow of her head. Her last stop was the bread stall near the oven house, a long, low stone building where flames licked the mouth of the earth itself. The smell of baking flatbread was nearly overwhelming in its comfort. Smoke, warmth, flour, and thyme. She waited as a young man pulled steaming rounds from the stone floor with a long paddle. His arms were dusted white, his forehead shining. He saw her and lifted 2 loaves without question. The usual. "Still feeding that crowd?" he asked, his tone light. "They never stop growing," she replied. As she placed the warm bread into her basket, her fingers brushed the crust. It was still hot. For a moment she held the basket close, letting the heat seep through the linen. It felt like a memory of winter, even in the heat. On her way back she slowed near the street's edge, where a blind man sat with a wooden flute. He played a tune without urgency, a soft river of sound that wrapped around the day without asking anything in return. Layla dropped a date into his bowl, one of her own, saved from that morning. He did not speak but nodded once as if acknowledging an unseen agreement. When she returned to the house gate, she paused just for a moment and looked back at the street. It was the same as always, loud, colorful, imperfect, but alive. And it had held her gently. She entered again into the hush of the home. The transition was like dipping into a cool pool after walking in sun. She set down her basket and began sorting the items in silence. No one would ask how the market had been. No one needed to. The scent of bread, the flicker of a smile, the calm in her eyes, those were the stories she carried home. By the time Layla returned from the market and placed her basket on the kitchen counter, the sun was directly overhead. Its light flooded the small courtyard, turning the stone tiles into a mosaic of shadow and heat. Everything slowed. The birds stopped their song, the air itself thickened, and even the leaves on the fig tree stood still as if holding their breath. Inside the kitchen, Hannah was wiping her brow with a corner of her sleeve. The pot of lentils from earlier now rested off the fire, cooling slightly beside a dish of cucumbers, sliced into thin coins, gleaming with vinegar and dill. "You were quick," Hannah said without turning. "The fig man was in a good mood," Layla replied, beginning to unpack the coriander and bread. She moved without sound, her hands familiar with the dance of preparation. Unwrap, slice, rinse, place. The meal was simple, but it carried with it the richness of care. Lentils simmered to softness, bread still warm from the oven, figs cut into halves, their purple skins split like little mouths opening to laughter, cheese wrapped in palm leaves, and water, clear, cool, precious, poured from the clay jug into copper cups that sweated in the heat. Layla helped carry the trays to the main room where the family would eat. She moved like a breeze, there, but unobtrusive. A whisper of presence. She laid each dish in its proper place, bread on the low central tray, lentils in a shallow bowl with a wooden ladle, the pickles beside the cheese, and the figs at the edge, like a final soft punctuation. From the hallway came the sound of the family approaching, the rustle of robes, the light patter of children's feet, the hum of casual conversation. Layla stood back as always, eyes down, hands folded. Lady Amina entered first, her jewelry catching the sunlight. Behind her came her husband, a merchant whose voice was calm but heavy, like the Nile in deep water. The children followed, already, squabbling softly over who would sit where. As they settled, Layla and another servant moved in quiet tandem, offering water, unfolding cloth napkins, adjusting cushions. No commands were spoken. Everything was understood. This was choreography, not labor. When the family began eating, Layla stepped back into the kitchen. Here, in this cooler, shadowed place, she and Hannah would share their own meal. They sat on the kitchen bench, the bread between them torn by hand, the lentils ladled into clay bowls. There was no ceremony here, only comfort, the kind that came from years of repetition, of shared hunger and shared silence. Layla dipped her bread, chewed slowly, savoring the tang of vinegar from the cucumber salad. Her body welcomed the pause. The morning had been long. The warmth of food was not just in its temperature, but in its ability to settle the mind. Hannah, for her part, ate with quiet approval. She rarely spoke during meals. She said once that talking while eating made the food feel rushed, as though it were merely a task to complete. Today, though, she broke that rule. "You've grown stronger," she said, between bites. Layla looked, up unsure what part of her revealed this. "Your arms," Hannah added. "I saw how you carried the water yesterday, steady." Layla smiled faintly, not out of pride, but gratitude. Strength was not something she sought, but it was something she welcomed when it arrived. After the meal, the dishes were washed with the slow rhythm of the hour. No urgency now. The family would retire for rest. Even the youngest would be encouraged to lie down. The house would enter its hush. Layla dried the bowls and placed them on the high shelf. Then with a damp cloth she wiped the table where they had eaten, moving in slow circles. The wood was old, worn smooth by years of hands, just like hers. When she was done, she stepped out into the courtyard. The sun blazed above, but the fig tree gave a pocket of shade, and she stood there, breathing deeply. The quiet was almost complete. From somewhere beyond the walls came only the occasional call of a street seller, distant now, muffled by heat and stone. Layla leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. In this moment, she allowed herself to drift, not into sleep, but into a kind of waking dream. A memory, or perhaps just a wish, of her mother's voice singing as she prepared a meal in a village far away, of the way sunlight once touched the field behind her childhood home, of a goat braying, of laughter too loud to hold. She did not long for escape. She only longed to remember, because memory, like a well-tended plant, gave shade when life grew too bright. Behind her, the kitchen breathed out its final warmth. The courtyard, stone and tree alike, whispered the language of rest, and Layla, in the stillness of the hour, felt no burden, only the softness of time passing, slow as honey in the sun. After the last of the midday chores had been completed, the house sank into a lull as though exhaling after a long morning. Doors were drawn, curtains closed. Even the wind seemed to hush in reverence for the ancient tradition of rest that followed, the noon meal. In Fustat, nothing stirred under the heat of early afternoon unless it absolutely had to. Layla moved quietly through the corridor that led back to the servants' quarters, her steps slow but not tired. She wasn't weary in the heavy sense, not yet. It was more the kind of softness that came when the body was given permission to pause, when the air itself seemed to cradle her limbs. Her small room, tucked at the corner near the outer courtyard wall, held no luxury. Just the same worn mat of palm leaves, the cloth bundle for a pillow, and a bowl of water now slightly warm from the day's heat. But to Layla, it was a sanctuary, not because of what it contained, but because of what it allowed: silence, stillness, and most precious of all, dreaming. She lay down on her side, one hand beneath her cheek, the other resting loosely on her waist. Her eyes, though heavy, lingered open a moment longer. From her narrow window she could see a slice of sky, brilliant blue and unforgiving. A single cloud drifted by, as if hesitant to disturb the expanse. Then her eyelids closed. Sleep came, not like a curtain falling, but like a tide rolling in, slow and inevitable. Her thoughts softened at the edges. Time loosened its grip, and the world she knew faded gently into one woven of memory and longing. In her dream, she was not in Fustat. She stood in a field of golden wheat, stretching far beyond any wall or courtyard. The air was cooler, touched by the scent of lemon, blossoms and river reeds. Her robe was lighter, billowing with the breeze, and her feet were bare, pressing into warm earth. There was no roof above her, only sky, vast and unbroken. Someone laughed nearby, a familiar voice, her mother perhaps, or maybe herself as a child. She turned, but the figure had already vanished into the light. Still, the laughter echoed. Not sad, not haunting, just far away and fond. She wandered dreamlike through this endless plain. At her side walked a goat with a ribbon around its neck. It glanced at her occasionally as if to say, "You remember me, don't you?" She reached to touch its head, and it leaned in without fear. Further on she came upon a tree with stars in its branches, tiny points of light, flickering like oil lamps. Beneath it sat the woman from the scroll, the weaver who stitched the sky into cloth. She was older than Layla imagined, with long silver hair and hands ink-stained from thread. She didn't speak, but she gestured gently, inviting Layla to sit. Together, they worked at a loom that appeared from nowhere. Layla, even in her dream, felt uncertain. She had never touched a loom, but the weaver smiled, and somehow Layla's fingers knew what to do. She passed the shuttle through threads of moonlight and pulled the warp tight. The cloth they made shimmered like river water at dusk. And then a voice, a soft one, barely louder than a whisper. "It's your sky now." Layla looked up. The weaver was gone. So was the tree. Only the fabric remained, folded gently across her lap. It felt impossibly light. And then it too vanished. Her breath shifted. Her dream trembled. A sound, faint, real, tugged her toward waking. A child's footstep, perhaps, or the rustle of a curtain drawn too quickly. The tide of sleep began to pull back, and Layla followed, reluctantly but peacefully. She opened her eyes to her small room, unchanged. The sky outside her window was no longer pure blue but tinged with the faintest hint of gold, the promise of afternoon shifting toward evening. She lay there for a few moments longer, allowing the dream to dissolve gently. She did not rush to rise. There was stillness in her bones, and her limbs were slow to move. The dream lingered not in full images now, but in feelings, the breeze, the laughter, the weightlessness of a life unburdened. Finally, She sat up. She smoothed her scarf and reached for the bowl of water. The touch of it to her face was grounding, real, and yet somewhere deep within the weaver's words echoed once more, "It's your sky now." Layla didn't know what it meant, not truly. But she carried the phrase with her like a hidden charm, tucked beneath her thoughts. The house was beginning to wake again. She could hear it in the creak of footsteps above, the murmur of voices through walls, the sudden clatter of a spoon dropped in haste. Her moment of stillness was over, but it had given her something. Not just rest, but quiet remembrance of who she was before the tasks, before the trays and bread and figs and dust. She stood and smoothed her robe. Another part of the day awaited. There would be tea to prepare, and Lady Amina's embroidery to fetch, and sandals to dust before the evening visit. But for now her feet touched the floor softly, as if the ground itself remembered the dream too. The late afternoon arrived not with fanfare, but with a subtle shift. The sun, once relentless, softened its gaze, and shadows stretched longer, cooler across the tiled courtyard. Birds began to stir again, their coos tentative as if testing the quiet. Somewhere beyond the garden walls the city's pulse slowed, matching the rhythm of the waning heat. In the kitchen, Layla prepared the tea. It was not the grand tea of feasts or celebrations, no sugared almonds, no tiny cakes with candied peel. This was house tea meant for the mistress and her sister who was visiting for the week. Air pot of strong black leaves, steeped just long enough to darken but not to bite, poured through a cloth sieve into a glazed ceramic pot. She added a small handful of crushed mint leaves and stirred slowly, letting the scent rise with the steam. It was a scent Layla loved, green and fresh yet warm, like the promise of shade on a hot day. Beside the pot she arranged a small tray of figs, a dish of almonds, and a bowl of carob syrup, rich and thick, meant to be dipped with bread, or sipped slowly by the spoon. Once the tray was balanced and set, she carried it through the corridor to the garden veranda, where Lady Amina and her sister Fatima sat upon embroidered cushions. They were in conversation, not loud, but engaged, voices woven like threads over an old tapestry. Layla approached quietly, her steps practiced to avoid the creaky board near the veranda post. She bowed her head as she placed the tray on the low table between them, eyes lowered, hands steady. Neither woman paused in their talk, but Fatima gave her a fleeting glance, not unkind, just fleeting, like someone noting the wind had changed. Layla poured the tea, first for Lady Amina, who accepted it with a small nod, then for Fatima, whose bracelet-clad hand reached with a practiced grace. The scent of mint filled the space, and for a moment even the distant sounds of the city felt muted. She did not speak. Servants in moments like this were meant to be present but invisible, like the breeze, like the furniture. And yet she listened, not out of curiosity but out of instinct. A story, even when not meant for you, is like a stream. Its sound will find your ears regardless. The women spoke of things Layla only half understood, of silk prices, of a neighbor's marriage, of someone's brother sailing north with a caravan of linen and soapstone. They spoke with laughter in their throats, not cruel but casual, the kind of laughter that comes from not having to worry who might be listening. Fatima mentioned Cairo, and Layla's ears perked ever so slightly. "It's too crowded," Fatima said, sipping her tea. "Even the cats seem tired of jostling, and everyone's voice tries to be louder than the next." "But still," Amina replied, "you always return with silk and stories." Fatima smiled. "Stories, yes, though not always worth the fabric. I trade for them." Layla allowed herself a brief glance at the two women. She wondered what it was like to gather stories as one might gather fruit. To walk through a market not with a basket, but with a hungry heart. Tasting accents, glimpsing faces, hearing music not sung in one's own streets. Once the tea was served, Layla stepped back into the shadows. She did not return to the kitchen immediately. Instead, she stood just beyond the hanging curtain, out of sight but within reach in case another cup was desired or the carob needed replenishing. She leaned gently against the wall, feeling the cool of the plaster through her sleeve. The words of the women drifted to her, then away like smoke. And in their pauses, in the space between topics, Layla allowed her own mind to speak. What stories would she tell if someone asked? She imagined herself at the edge of a caravan fire, telling of the kitchen that smelled of lentils and mint, of a dream with a goat and a tree full of stars, of Lady Amina's children, the prince and the cat queen, and how she once sewed a tear in a curtain so well that no one noticed it had ever been there. They would be quiet stories, not of gold or great cities, but of moments, of the sound of bread cracking just as it cools, of the way light falls through a lattice at midday, of how even a worn mat can feel like a throne when the world is still. The laughter of the women faded into memory, and eventually the tea was finished. Lady Amina clapped her hands once, soft but clear, a signal. Layla stepped forward and began to clear the tray, her movements fluid, the pot still warm, the figs mostly untouched, the almonds half-eaten. As she turned to go, Fatima spoke, not to her but aloud as if tasting the air. "She's quiet, that one," she said, "but her eyes are full of stories." Layla did not answer. She didn't need to. The words floated behind her like a veil, trailing softly as she walked. Back in the kitchen, she rinsed the cups in silence, her fingers tracing the rim of the pot, where the scent of mint still lingered. As the light of afternoon began to slip toward evening, Layla returned from the kitchen with the now empty tea tray, her hands steady, her mind gently elsewhere. The courtyard had changed again, no longer flooded with sun. It now held shadows shaped like leaves, fluttering softly over stone. The world was cooling inch by inch, and with it came the quiet return of energy, the gentle tug of evening tasks. This was the time of the small things, as Hannah called them, not the large chores of morning nor the ceremonial preparations of night, but the little acts of care and order that filled the space between. Layla began with the sandals. Near the entrance of the main house, pairs of soft leather sandals sat in disarray, left behind by children racing through doorways, by guests who had stayed longer than planned, by Lady Amina herself, who had always preferred to walk barefoot in the garden. Layla knelt, gathering them one by one. She brushed the dust from their soles, wiped the straps with a damp cloth, and placed each pair neatly where it belonged, toes pointed out like sleeping animals. It was not a task anyone noticed. No one ever said, "Thank you for arranging my sandals." But Layla didn't mind. There was something soothing in the order, a whisper of respect for the people who walked in them, for their journeys, even the ones just across a courtyard. Next, she moved to the cushions in the sitting room, gently refluffing, patting them into shape, tucking stray tassels back where they belonged. One cushion bore a slight tea stain. From earlier, she dabbed it with rose water and linen, careful not to scrub too hard. The fabric was delicate, hand-embroidered by Lady Amina's mother, whose portrait still hung in the main hall, framed in dustless glass. Then came the task of dusting, not every surface, but the secret ones, the edge of the window lattice, the carved ledge above the lanterns, the backs of door frames where fingers never touched, but time did. Layla moved with a soft cloth and a bowl of lemon water, her strokes light and rhythmic, like a breeze combing through reeds. As she worked, she hummed, just a little tune, no words, one her mother used to sing while folding clothes, the kind of melody that didn't ask to be remembered, yet always was. Sometimes as she dusted, Layla imagined she was a caretaker, not of a house, but of memories. Each mark she wiped, each corner she smoothed, was a story being tended to, polished back into presence. Who had leaned against this wall a decade ago? Whose laughter had echoed down this hall when the plaster was still white? The day was made of such questions, and she never needed answers. From outside she heard the cry of a vendor, "Pomegranates, sweet as honey," and the brief laughter of children chasing the sound. In the distance, a donkey brayed once, then silence again. She returned to the servants' passage and fetched the needle box. There were always minor repairs to tend to in the quiet hour, a hem on a robe, a torn sleeve, a fraying tassel. Today it was Tariq's doll, a simple figure stuffed with cotton, its arms too often tugged by little fingers. One shoulder had torn open. Layla sat cross-legged on the mat near the kitchen doorway, threading her needle with practiced ease. The sky above the courtyard had turned a pale peach, and the first chirps of returning birds filtered through the latticework. She stitched slowly, carefully, each loop of thread pulling the soft cloth back together, just as her presence stitched the house's small moments into wholeness. She was not its center, but she was its quiet edge holding it together. As she worked, she heard Hannah in the kitchen, crushing garlic with the flat of her blade, murmuring to herself about the evening stew. The scent of cumin rose again, this time sharper, cooked into lamb broth. Layla's stomach grumbled softly, but she smiled. The smell of supper meant the day was nearing its gentlest part. When the doll was whole again, she placed it on the child's bed, tucking it into the corner, as though it too needed to rest. Then she returned to the storeroom to fetch more linen for the evening towels. There was always something to do, but never too much, not in this hour, and perhaps that was the secret of the small things. They asked little of you, but they gave much. They steadied the house, like stitches in a robe that no one saw but without which the cloth would fall apart. As twilight crept in through the slats and shadows softened into dusk, Layla felt the calm of the moment settle in her chest. The noise of the day had passed, and the hush before evening's arrival gave her room to breathe. She sat on the stone bench once more, where she had begun her morning, and looked up at the sky. It was no longer a searing blue, but something gentler, lavender and rose and fading gold, the kind of sky that asked nothing, only offered itself. And Layla, in her quiet way, offered something back. A presence, a care, a life of small things not so small. As the last warmth of the sun faded from the courtyard tiles, the house stirred once more, not with the bright energy of morning, but with the slower, more deliberate rhythm of approaching night. Layla felt it in the way the shadows leaned. Longer, in the sudden flick of torches being lit outside the gate, and in the soft creak of doors opening after the long hush of afternoon. Evening in the household was never loud. It didn't arrive like a guest banging at the gate. It slipped in, familiar and steady, like an old friend who knew exactly where the light switch was. Layla stepped into the kitchen, where Hannah was preparing the night's meal with a calm efficiency born of years behind the hearth. A large clay pot sat on the center stone, its lid slightly ajar, letting out little gusts of steam that smelled of lamb, cardamom, and rice. It was the kind of food that told the stomach, "You are safe now." "The stew will need 10 more minutes," Hannah said, without turning. "You can light the lamps." Layla nodded, already reaching for the oil jug and wicks. The lamps of the house were few and humble, small bowls of bronze or clay, filled with olive oil and fitted with thin cotton wicks that curled slightly when lit. They didn't cast much light, but it was enough. Enough to soften a room. Enough to let shadows dance without becoming frightening. She lit them one by one. First, the kitchen lamp, its flame flickered against the blackened wall, casting Hannah's silhouette like a shadow puppet. Then the small hallway near the children's, room where soft feet would soon tiptoe in search of dolls or stories. The sitting room came next, where Lady Amina would recline with her embroidery, and perhaps her husband would read aloud from a scroll if the mood took him. Last, the lamp near the front door, always kept low and steady, so returning family members or late guests could find their way. Lighting that lamp always gave Layla pause. Something about its glow facing outward, into the world, reminded her that life went on beyond these walls. Once the house was aglow with its quiet lanterns, she returned to the kitchen to prepare the water for washing. The basins were filled with warm water from the stove. Each child would have their hands and faces washed before supper. Layla prepared soft cloths for drying and sprinkled a few drops of rose water into one of the bowls. Not necessary, but kind. When Amal arrived first, bouncing into the kitchen with curls askew and hands dusty from evening play, Layla didn't scold. She simply smiled and guided her gently to the bowl. "Did you run through the garden again?" she asked, dipping the cloth. "I was hunting moon crickets," Amal declared proudly. Layla washed her hands carefully, then her face dabbing beneath. The chin behind the ears, Amal scrunched her nose at the rosewater. "You smell like a flower," Layla teased. "I'm a fierce hunter, not a flower." Amal pouted but giggled all the same. Tariq arrived soon after, quieter as always. He sat patiently as Layla repeated the ritual. She never asked what he hunted. She simply pressed a cool cloth to his brow and waited for the small sigh that told her he had returned fully to himself. After the children were clean and their sandals lined up near the sitting room, Layla returned to the kitchen for the final preparation. The flatbread was placed beside the stew. A small bowl of yogurt with mint, a plate of dates and cheese. It was not a feast, but it was generous, enough for full bellies and quiet gratitude. She and another servant carried the meal to the main room, laying the dishes on the low table while the family gathered. Again, Layla stood silently by, waiting for the nods, the brief words of thanks, the small acknowledgements that their labor had been seen. Then, as the family began to eat, she slipped away, not back to her room yet, but to the little side space near the courtyard where she and Hannah would eat together. Their own supper was simpler, a smaller bowl of stew, a wedge of bread, a slice of cucumber. But it was good. It was enough. The sky beyond the open window had turned deep blue now, the stars beginning to blink into place like tiny, watchful eyes. Layla ate slowly, savoring the softness of the rice, the heat of the lamb, the cool relief of mint. Across from her, Hannah said little, but the lines around her mouth had softened, her version of a smile. When they finished, they washed the bowls together in silence. The water was cool now, and the oil lamps cast golden arcs on the walls. Later, when the dishes were dry and the family was drifting into their night routines, Layla returned once more to her small room. The lamps along the hallway flickered gently. Somewhere in the distance, a flute played, faint, wandering notes as though the night itself were humming. Layla sat on her mat and looked again at the sliver of sky above her window. It had deepened to indigo, flecked with stars. The same sky she'd seen as a child, the same one her mother had sung beneath, the same one she hoped that would greet her dreams. She exhaled slowly, feeling the house settle around her. The house was not grand. Her day had not been extraordinary, but it had been full of movement, of care, of presence, and now it would rest, just like her. The hush of the night was unlike any other silence. It was not simply the absence of sound, it was the settling of everything, stone, air, fabric, breath. The house seemed to exhale one last time and then grow still, like a great creature curling itself into sleep. Layla sat in the corner of her small room, knees drawn loosely to her chest, back resting against the cool plaster wall. Her oil lamp had been dimmed to a faint glow, just enough to see the soft outlines of her space. The mat, the water bowl, the tiny scrap of embroidered cloth from her mother, now folded carefully beneath her sleeping mat. Each object held its place, and with it, a whisper of belonging. She liked this hour best, not because it was restful, though it was, not because her body finally had permission to be still, though it did, but because this was the hour when she belonged only to herself. All day, she was Layla the maid, Layla the quiet, Layla the steady hands, the soother of children, the bearer of trays, the tamer of bread and dust and dolls. But now, in this thin space of time before sleep, she was simply Layla. She did not always know what that meant. The self beneath the roles was quiet, like a song played far away. But she felt it here, in her chest, in the curve of her breath, in the weight of silence on her skin. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The day passed before her like shadows on water, the soft weight of the tea tray, Amal's laughter. About moon crickets, Tariq's solemn eyes as she stitched his doll, the scent of mint, of cumin, of rose water on warm cloth, the flickering oil lamps, the sandals realigned with care. Each moment small, yet strung together, they made a necklace of something precious, not jewels, not silver, but memory. Living, a memory. She thought of the scroll again, the weaver under the tree of stars. In her dream, the cloth she had woven shimmered like the Nile at dusk. But what would she weave now, if given loom and thread? Perhaps the curve of a crescent lamp, the touch of warm bread, the sound of water poured into a copper basin, the way her name had been spoken, once, lightly, by a guest who didn't know not to notice her. Or maybe she would weave silence itself, this silence, so deep it could cradle thought. She did not cry. Layla was not one who cried often, and when she did, it was not from sorrow. It was from fullness, from carrying so much inside without knowing where to set it down. Tonight, though, there were no tears, only stillness. She reached for the bowl of water beside her mat and took a final sip. The clay was cool against her hands. She rinsed her face once more, not out of need, but out of ritual. Her mother had taught her that night was like a second birth. You must enter it clean, so that your dreams may find you easily. She wrapped her scarf loosely around her head and lay down slowly, mat creaking beneath her as if greeting an old friend. The embroidered cloth was soft against her cheek. The lamp flickered once, then again, then went still. Outside, the city murmured in its own sleep. A camel brayed once in the distance. A night bird called briefly, then was gone. Beyond the courtyard wall, the fig tree rustled, not with wind, but with something more tender. The turning of the world, perhaps, the breath of the night. Inside, Layla breathed with it, in and out, no thoughts now. Only the steady hush of presence, the rhythm of the house, now part of her breath. The day was done, the tasks complete. And her name, Layla, hovered in the quiet like a lantern's last glow. She did not dream immediately, and when she did, the dream came softly. No weaver this time, no fields, just her own feet walking barefoot over warm stone. And ahead, the door of a house she had never seen but somehow always known. Sometime after the house had fallen fully into silence, when even the last lantern had winked out and the fig tree's leaves no longer stirred, a soft wind arrived, slipping through narrow alleys and over rooftops, brushing against faded shutters and worn stone with the gentleness of an old friend. It found its way to Layla's small window and passed through the wooden lattice with a sigh, carrying with it the coolness of the desert edge and the memory of distant oases. The air in her room shifted slightly. Her scarf rustled. A curl of hair fell over her cheek, and in her sleep Layla turned. The dream began without a door. There was no gate, no key, no signal. One moment she was drifting on the still waters of night, and the next she was walking, barefoot as always, down a path lined with silver stones. The world was both familiar and strange. The stars above her were brighter than she had ever seen. They pulsed like heartbeats in the sky, each one with its own rhythm. The moon hung low, not white, but golden, as though dipped in honey. It cast a soft light that made every shadow seem like an invitation. The path led her to a low hill, and at its top sat a figure, cloaked not in fabric, but in what looked like wind. It moved and shimmered and whispered, as if made of thousands, of tiny breezes all holding hands. Layla approached with neither fear nor urgency. In dreams one did not rush. One arrived. The figure did not speak in words. It only raised its hand and pointed to the horizon. There in the distance rose a city, not like Fustat, not made of sun-baked brick and bustling alleys, but of soft light and curving towers that glowed from within. The city breathed, its towers swaying slightly, as if it too were dreaming. Layla watched in awe. The wind figure turned back to her, and this time it spoke, not aloud, but inside her thoughts. "You've carried many things." Layla blinked, unsure how to answer. "Stories, trays, silence," the voice continued, not unkind, "and dreams that were never yours." Layla looked down at her hands. They were empty, yet they felt heavy, as if everything she had ever done still lingered there, in her palms, in her fingers, like the scent of spices that never fully faded. "But here," the wind voice said, "you may set them down." Layla knelt beside the path and opened her hands. Nothing fell from them, yet something changed. The heaviness lifted. Her chest felt wider, her breath deeper. Then the figure leaned closer, if something made of breeze could truly lean, and whispered something she could not quite hear. A name, perhaps, or a word too ancient for language. The world shifted again. Suddenly she stood in a courtyard that looked so very much like the one at home, the fig tree, the stone bench, the soft shadows. But there were no walls around it, only open space, and beyond that, fields of night flowers blooming in silence. She turned and saw people walking through the courtyard. Familiar and not. Her mother, Amina's children. Hannah, younger and laughing. Even the blind flute player from the market, his instrument made of starlight. They didn't notice her. Or maybe they did, and simply smiled without speaking. This was not a place for talk. This was a place for being. Layla sat on the stone bench and leaned her head back. The sky above her was vast, and she felt for the first time what it meant to belong without serving, to exist without waiting to be needed. She closed her eyes within the dream, and in that deeper sleep, the stars began to sing, not loudly, not with instruments, but with tones that wrapped around the soul. A kind of music that told her she was enough, that even the smallest of her tasks, the brushing of dust, the folding of linen, had echoed farther than she knew. The dream lasted, for as long as it needed to, and when it faded it did so like mist under morning sun, gently without pain. Layla did not wake with a start. She did not gasp or sit upright. She simply drifted back into the thin veil between dream and day, where breath is deep and heartbeats slow. The wind outside her window still stirred, and on her cheek that single curl of hair remained, a quiet reminder that something had passed through her room while she slept. The first light of dawn returned, as it always did, slow, golden and quiet. It crept over the rooftops of Fustat with the gentleness of someone who knows the house well and does not wish to wake it too suddenly. The pigeons cooed their morning notes, and somewhere beyond the alley, a vendor called to no one in particular, his voice still gravelly with sleep. Layla stirred before the sun reached her mat. Her body remembered the hour. even without the rooster's call or Hannah's footsteps. The rhythm of the day was in her muscles, her breath, the gentle ache of her shoulders. She did not wake with reluctance, nor with haste. Just as the night had welcomed her with soft wind and song, the morning now asked for her presence with equal calm. She sat up slowly, wrapped her scarf around her head and stretched one arm then the other. Her fingers brushed the embroidered cloth by her side, her mother's. She held it a moment longer than usual today, pressing it lightly to her lips. Then she stood. The bowl of water beside her had grown cool again. She dipped her hands in it, letting the chill kiss her palms and cheeks. It did not startle her awake, not anymore. It simply welcomed her into the world. In the courtyard, the fig tree swayed gently in the early breeze. A leaf fluttered to the ground as if to greet her. Layla bent to pick it up. The sky above was still the soft blue of early morning, untouched by the harsh white of later hours. The scent of damp stone and fresh air mingled, a rare fragrance gone too quickly once the sun truly rose. She stepped into the kitchen to find Hannah already awake, hunched slightly over the hearth, coaxing the first flame of the day. The old woman looked up, her face lined and familiar. "You dream well last night?" she asked, though she did not look for an answer. Layla only smiled. Together, without words, they began to work. The bread was reheated on the flat stone, turned slowly so it would not blacken. Dates were split and placed in a bowl, cheese unwrapped, water poured. The same movements as yesterday, the same as 100 yesterdays. And yet, Layla moved with something slightly different now. Not slower, not faster, but with a softness deeper than routine. Perhaps it was the wind, perhaps the dream. As she carried the breakfast tray up the steps toward Lady Amina's quarters, she paused a moment on the stairwell. From this height she could see across the rooftops, the city still quiet, the Nile in the distance catching the new sun on its back like a mirror turned upward. The tray in her hands felt no heavier than it had before, but her heart felt steadier. She reached the door and knocked. From inside, the sound of someone stirring. A soft call, permission to enter. She placed the tray where it always went. The bread, the cheese, the dates, the folded cloth, the small copper cup. Lady Amina looked at her with eyes still heavy with sleep. But there was something else there too. A pause. A faint curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the residue of someone else's own dream. "Thank you." "Layla," she said, as always. Layla bowed her head as always, but as she turned to go, she felt something shift. Not in the room, not in her mistress, but in herself. She did not smile, but she felt the echo of one just behind her lips. She moved through the house again, her steps light, her thoughts slower, and with each task that followed, sweeping, the dust that had returned in the night, brushing the cushions back into form, filling the water jugs again. She carried within her not just purpose, but presence. There would be no parade for her quietness, no fanfare for her steadiness. But that had never been her expectation. She belonged to the day, and the day in its quiet way belonged to her. Outside, the city began to wake in earnest. Wheels creaked, hooves clopped, bells jingled, voices called out prices, children argued, pigeons scattered. The world was alive again. Layla did not rush to meet it. She moved as she always did, unseen, steady, full of small kindnesses. But now, somewhere deep within her, the dream still hummed, a thread of song tucked just beneath the collar of her robe. And though no one would see it, she would carry it through the day, like a hidden embroidery stitched into the lining of her life. The morning sun had risen higher now, warm enough to heat the stone corridors but not yet fierce. A gentle breeze wandered in from the west, carrying with the dry scent of linen left too long in the sun and the soft perfume of orange blossoms. from a neighboring courtyard. Layla stood in the vestibule near the main hall, a small cloth bundle in her hands. Inside was Lady Amina's favorite overrobe, not particularly grand but finely stitched, with threads of silver curling along its hem like delicate vines. One of the side seams had come loose, and rather than patch it at home, Lady Amina had insisted it be repaired properly. "She'll know how to match the thread," Amina had said, referring to Safia the tailor, whose tiny shop sat 3 alleys over, tucked behind the old spice market. Layla was glad for the errand. Not because it broke the day's pattern, but because walking through the city, even briefly, felt like breathing a different kind of air, a slower, wider breath. She wrapped the robe carefully in a protective cloth and stepped out the house gate. The air outside was already layered with sound, someone calling for eggs, a cartwheel bumping over a stone, a woman humming to her baby while sweeping her stoop. Layla moved through it all with quiet grace, her steps measured, her scarf pulled slightly forward to shield her face from the strengthening sun. She passed the bakery where smoke curled from the chimney like a black silk ribbon. She passed the copper workers' courtyard, where sparks occasionally leapt from hammer to sky. And then she reached the tailor's corner. It was a humble shop. Not even a shop, really, more a shaded nook between 2 larger buildings with shelves built into the wall and lengths of fabric folded with care on every available surface. Threads hung in skeins like candy for the eyes, gold, saffron, indigo, deep red. Safia herself was seated on a low stool, her back straight, her fingers working on a child's tunic, with the kind of ease that comes from decades of repetition. She looked up as Layla approached, her eyes sharp but kind. "Ha! The house of Amina sends a visitor." Layla bowed slightly and extended the bundle, seam at the side. She said, "Only your thread will do." Safia accepted the cloth as though accepting something sacred. She opened it delicately, like a scroll, and examined the seam. Her fingers moved over the fabric not with haste, but with attention. "This thread is from the northern dye markets. Tricky to match, but not impossible," she said. Then she looked up. "Give me a short while. Sit, if you like." Layla nodded, settling on a stone ledge shaded by an awning. For a few moments neither spoke. The city around them murmured. A boy ran past, chasing a rooster. 2 men argued, cheerfully, over the weight of onions. A lute played softly somewhere, the notes lazy and playful. Safia worked steadily, her needle dancing. "You come from the village south of Fustat, yes?" she asked without looking up. Layla blinked. "I do. How did you know? You walk like someone who grew up where the roads are dirt, not stone. You look at people, but also at trees. And," she added, glancing briefly at Layla's hands, "you fold cloth like someone whose mother taught her carefully." Layla didn't respond, not because she was startled, though she was, but because something about the words felt like a gift, and gifts sometimes ask for silence in return. Safia continued her work, and after a while began to hum. It was an old melody, one Layla hadn't heard since she was a child, a lullaby about boats on the Nile and the wind that carries wishes. Her chest tightened with recognition, but she said nothing. Finally, Safia knotted the thread and snipped it with a practiced flick. She folded the robe again, gently, and tied the cloth around it. "She'll never see the seam," she said, "but it will hold better than before." Layla rose, bowed her thanks, and accepted the bundle with both hands, but Safia wasn't done. "Tell your lady," she said, voice softer now, "that cloth, like people, sometimes breaks where it is most worn. But if mended well, that place becomes the strongest." Layla met her eyes for a moment, steady, warm, knowing, then nodded once. As she walked back, the streets were brighter, busier, but within her there was a stillness. Not of sleep, but of quiet connection, the feeling of being seen not as a role but as a whole. She returned to the house through the side gate, her footsteps slower, the robe now more than just a garment. It was a thread in her own story, a piece of fabric touched by hands, mended with care, and carried with meaning. Just as Layla returned through the side gate, the robe carefully folded in her arms, she heard it. A soft, familiar sound carried through the hallway. Not urgent, but insistent. Not loud, but unmistakable. Layla. It was Amal, the call, drawn out like a thread, her voice wrapped in curiosity rather than complaint. Layla smiled faintly. She quickened her pace only slightly, rounding the courtyard and slipping her shoes off at the hallway threshold. Inside the children's room, the light had softened to that mid-morning hush, filtered through the latticework into little squares that danced over cushions, floor, and toys. Amal was sprawled on the floor, hair tangled as always, her arms outstretched. Dramatically. "I was dying of boredom," she announced. Layla raised an eyebrow. "You sound very alive to me." "Barely," Amal said with a sigh. "Tariq won't play pretend unless he gets to be the eagle again, and I said that eagles don't wear red shoes." In the far corner, Tariq sat solemnly, one red slipper on the wrong foot, his wooden camel in one hand, and a scarf tied around his head like a turban. He didn't speak, but looked up at Layla with those deep, still eyes. She set the cloth bundle aside and lowered herself to the cushion beside them. "Perhaps," Layla said carefully, "it's a very fashionable eagle." Tariq did not smile, not fully, but the corner of his mouth twitched just enough. Amal leaned her head against Layla's knee. "Tell us a story, please." Layla glanced around the room. Toys were everywhere. A wooden duck missing a wheel, the doll with the stitched shoulder, a stack of cloth squares used for building castles or camps. The air smelled faintly of soap, old linen, and fig leaves. "A short one," Layla said. Amal brightened. Tariq leaned in. And so Layla began. "There was once a cat," she said, "who lived in a palace made entirely of pillows." Amal gasped. Delighted. But she was not just any cat. She was the royal napkeeper. It was her job to make sure everyone in the palace, even the vizier, got their proper rest. She continued, weaving the tale as she often did, slowly, gently, with her voice lowering into a rhythm as steady as breath. The children leaned closer, bodies relaxing even as their minds followed every word. In the story, the cat solved disputes between overworked guards and forgetful scribes by assigning nap schedules. She defeated a dragon not with claws, but with a lullaby so powerful it put the beast to sleep for 100 years, and earned her a medal made of cheese. By the time the story ended, Amal was curled against Layla's side, eyelids heavy. Tariq lay back on his mat, his scarf slipping from his forehead, one hand still gripping his toy. Layla smoothed Amal's hair gently. She did not rush to leave. The room was quiet now, filled with the warmth of small bodies and soft dreams. It was one of those rare golden moments, not planned, not commanded, where time seemed to slow down and deepen. She looked at them both. They were not her children. She had no children. But in these moments, she felt something maternal stir within her, not the claim of ownership but the pull of care, a tenderness that had grown not from a single moment, but from hundreds of small ones stitched together like patchwork, a fever cooled, a nightmare soothed, a game indulged after a long day. Layla stood at last, careful not to wake them, and adjusted. The curtain so more light would not fall across their faces. The fig tree's shadow had begun to shift again. She picked up the robe and exited the room with her usual quiet grace. Outside, the house was still in its daytime rhythm. Voices in the distance, water pouring somewhere, the rustle of sweeping. But in her heart, Layla carried the softness of that hour in the children's room, like a warm cloth tucked under her scarf. Some parts of her day demanded strength, some asked for silence. But this was the part that asked only for presence. And Layla, as always, gave it fully. It happened just after noon, when the kitchen was between states. The fire banked low, the pots scrubbed clean, and the next meal still hours away. The light from the courtyard had turned golden and direct, pouring in through the narrow window, to settle over everything like a silent blessing. Layla was carrying the water jug. It was old, a large clay jar with a rounded body and a thick lip worn smooth from years of use. Its surface bore patterns of faded glaze, once deep blue, now ghost pale from sun and scrubbing. It had always been heavy, but her arms had grown into its weight long ago. She was almost to the basin when her sandal caught on a loose stone. Not a stumble, not even a full misstep. Just a shift in balance, a twitch of the heel. The jar slipped. She caught it barely, her hands snapping tight around the middle. The water inside sloshed hard. The sound echoed, loud in the kitchen stillness. But nothing shattered. Not quite. There was only a sound like a sigh, a dry, sharp whisper. She set it down slowly and turned it in the light. A thin crack now ran along the jar's neck, hairline but unmistakable, not deep enough to break it. Today but one day. One day it would open wide and everything it held would spill. Layla stood still, her breath shallow, not from fear, not even from shame, but from recognition. She knew this kind of crack. It was the kind that came not from one moment, but from many, from heat and time, from carrying too much for too long, from small shifts and sudden silences. It was the kind that stayed hidden until one small thing, a loose stone, a forgotten corner, revealed what had already been growing inside. She ran her thumb over the mark. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was to the jar or to herself. Hannah heard the noise from the other room and came in. "Did it break?" "No," Layla said, her voice even. Hannah looked at the jar, then at Layla's face. She didn't ask for more. "Then it's fine," she said simply. "We'll use it until we can't." And she turned back to the herbs she'd been chopping. Layla remained a moment longer. She touched the clay again, gently, then picked it up and poured its water into the basin. It held for now. The rest of the afternoon unfolded without incident. Bread was wrapped, the stew was stirred, the children laughed in the hallway. The rhythm resumed, as it always did. But inside, Layla felt the echo of that small crack. Not painful, not loud, just present. As she swept the sitting room, she thought of things she had never said. She had never told Lady Amina that she missed the scent of her mother's cooking more than she missed the taste. She had never told Hannah that her lullabies, mumbled while folding towels, sometimes brought Layla to the edge of tears. She had never told the children that their messes, the toys, the cushions, the stains, gave her a strange sense of purpose, like footprints that proved someone had passed through the day joyfully. She had never told herself how tired she sometimes was, not from work but from holding things, big emotions, dreams, silence, with nowhere to set them down. And yet she never complained. She folded, she swept, she stirred, she smiled when expected, she bowed when needed. And in the quiet of the evening she laid herself down like the final cloth of the day, smooth, still, necessary. But today the crack in the jar reminded her, even what holds most gracefully may one day give way. That thought didn't frighten her, but it stayed with her. Later, as she finished her duties, Layla passed by the jar once more. It stood in its usual place now, back on its shelf, the crack invisible in shadow. No one would notice, but she knew. And because she knew, she took an extra cloth and folded it under the jar's base, softening its rest. A small kindness, a quiet acknowledgement. Because sometimes the things we don't say are still heard, especially by the parts of us we carry day after day without complaint, until one moment reveals the shape of what's been held too long. The sun had just dipped beneath the edge of the rooftops when the household door knock came. Not the gentle knock of a neighbor, nor the quick tapping of a child, but a firm, measured sound that echoed through the wooden frame with quiet authority. Layla was in the kitchen when she heard it. She paused, her hands deep in the basin of lentils, and looked up toward the hallway. Hannah, at the hearth, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. They both knew a visitor at this hour meant something out of the ordinary. Moments later, the younger maid, Yasmin, came through the archway breathless. Lady Amina says prepare for a guest, a scholar, from Alexandria. Hannah muttered something about fish on a Thursday and resumed tending to the bread. Layla wiped her hands and began assembling a tray. Guests, especially learned ones, meant not just tea but fruit, honey, fresh cloths for wiping hands, and the good cups kept behind the embroidered curtain. Layla worked in practiced silence, her movements calm but precise. She chose figs without bruises, pomegranate seeds glistening in a bowl, a small dish of dried apricots, and thick golden tahini swirled with a curl of date syrup. The tea would be brewed with cinnamon tonight, subtle, fragrant, the kind that lingered in the air long after the cup was drained. As she prepared, she wondered about this scholar. What did men from Alexandria speak of? Stars? Scripts? Maps of places she'd only seen drawn in chalk by market storytellers? Did they wear robes with scrolls tucked in the sleeves? Did they notice the way servants moved? Probably not, she thought. But still, the idea of someone from far away, someone who had touched papyrus older than the bricks of this house, stirred a strange interest in her. She carried the tray with quiet elegance through the corridor, her eyes focused ahead, her breath slow. The sitting room had been changed in her absence, cushions plumped, a brass lamp lit. Lady Amina sat with her back straight, her finest shawl draped across her shoulders. The guest sat opposite her. He was not old. That surprised Layla. His beard was trimmed, his robes clean but simple, and his eyes, dark and bright, seemed to drink in everything at once without rushing to speak. He looked at Layla when she entered. Not directly, not rudely, just enough to register her, to acknowledge her place in the room. That, too, was unusual. She placed the tray carefully, poured the tea, and offered the fruit. Then, as always, she withdrew to the edge of the room, becoming part of the background, a soft shape in the corner, there if needed, invisible if not. The conversation began in low tones, polite inquiries, talk of the city's dust, the state of the northern roads. Then it drifted slowly into deeper waters, the uses of ink, the patterns of bird migration, the translations of an old poem that none of them had ever read in the original tongue. Layla didn't understand every word, but some phrases caught her, like threads of a familiar fabric. Memory as a place, the voice of silence, truth folded into parable. The scholar's voice was calm, but it carried weight, as if each syllable had been chosen from a shelf of carefully labeled jars. At one point he said, "The things we do not name are often the ones we feel most deeply." And Lady Amina replied, "That's why the poets have work." They both smiled, and in the corner Layla, though still, was not untouched. She felt something in her chest shift, not open, not close, just shift. It was not the kind of moment one remembered with clarity later, but it stayed in the body, like the warmth of tea long after the cup is gone. The evening wore on. The guest did not overstay. When he rose to leave, he thanked Lady Amina with a quiet nod and left a scroll behind. A gift, perhaps, or simply a thought made tangible. As he turned to go, his eyes flicked once more toward Layla. He did not speak, but again he saw her, and in a life of quiet corners, being seen even briefly, felt like light falling through a window, thought long, sealed. After he left, Layla cleared the tray. The figs were mostly untouched, the teapot nearly empty, the apricots gone. Lady Amina said nothing to her, just waved a hand gently, as though to dismiss the evening like smoke. In the kitchen, Layla washed the good cups with care, drying them with the embroidered towel reserved only for such visits. Her hands moved slowly, her mind not quite anywhere. Later, that night as she returned to her mat and unwrapped her scarf, she thought again of the scholar, of the way his voice shaped silence, of how he had looked, not with question, not with judgment, but with recognition. She wondered if he would remember her. Probably not, but she would remember the feeling, like someone had traced her outline in soft ink, and for a moment she had seen herself more clearly too. The night once again had wrapped itself around the city. The sounds of Fustat had quieted into near stillness. Only the occasional sigh of wind through the rooftops, the distant creak of wood from a cart left too long in the sun, and the sleepy cooing of pigeons finding new positions in their rooftop nests. Layla sat on the edge of her mat, a thin blanket folded neatly beside her, and her scarf half loosened around her neck. The oil lamp in her room, never lit for long, was now a faint flame, its wick curling delicately, casting soft shadows that danced like ghosts on the wall. She had finished her final tasks long ago. The dishes had been washed. The sitting room swept. The children checked once more before bed, their breathing steady, their small arms sprawled across blankets with the abandon only sleep allows. Yet Layla did not lie down immediately. Her eyes, weary but not heavy, drifted toward the small window near her mat. The night sky was cloudless. Her single star winked just visible, framed perfectly between the wooden lattice slats, as if placed there just for her. She exhaled slowly. The scholar's voice from earlier still echoed faintly in her mind. Not the words now, but the feeling. The way the room had held silence differently after each phrase. The strange sense of something passing between people that had nothing to do with their roles or names. She thought of how he had looked at her. Not long, not deeply, but fully, and perhaps what lingered wasn't being noticed but being acknowledged. The lamp flickered once more. Layla reached over and adjusted its cover slightly, dimming it just enough. Her fingers moved gently, as though not to disturb something fragile, as though even flame deserved to be put to bed with care. She unwrapped her scarf fully and folded it into a soft square beneath her pillow. Her hair, long and dark, fell across her shoulder in a single smooth arc, catching a glint of the last light. Then she lay down. The mat beneath her was familiar, every crease a memory of nights past. She curled slightly to one side, her knees drawing in, her hand resting over her chest, not tightly but like a pause in music before the next note. Her breath slowed, not just from tiredness, but from permission, the body's quiet agreement with the world that for now it could let go. The day unraveled gently behind her eyes, not as a list, not as events, but as a soft braid of sensations. The weight of the robe bundle, the smell of cinnamon tea, the curve of a smile on Tariq's lips, the faint crack in the clay jar, the scholar's voice saying, "The things we do not name." Layla's thoughts grew looser. She imagined again the tree from her dream, the one with stars in its branches. She did not try to reach it now. She only remembered its shape. She saw Amal asleep, one foot sticking out from the blanket, clutching a scarf as if it were treasure. She saw the fig leaf she'd picked up in the courtyard that morning, now forgotten on the windowsill. Its edges curled slightly from the day's heat. She felt the slow exhale of the house itself, a stillness that spoke not of emptiness, but of deep rest. Her own breath matched it. In, out. The lamp beside her flickered again, dimmer now. The room took on a velvet darkness, and the shadows on the walls grew softer, like ink dropped in water. No more thoughts came, no more names, just the soft hum of being, not awake, not yet dreaming, but somewhere between, where time was no longer a line but a gentle pool, and she was floating. Her last conscious feeling was one of warmth, not from the blanket, not from the mat, but from within. A warmth that said, "You were here and it mattered." Then the lamp went out and Layla slept. Before the first bird sang, before the first cup was filled, before even the fig tree rustled its leaves in the courtyard, Layla was already in the kitchen. The hearth was cold, its stones grey and still. The basket of flour sat waiting beside. The wall and the kindling, palm fronds dried and curled like sleeping insects, leaned in their clay pot like a bouquet of quiet purpose. She knelt beside the hearth, struck flint, and coaxed flame. This was how her day often began. Not with words, not even with thoughts, but with fire. And fire, she knew, did not like to be rushed. It needed respect, breath, rhythm. Too fast and it would hiss away, too slow and it would smother in smoke. So she fed it gently, palm frond, a sliver of linen. A breath. Another. The fire caught. It blinked, then bloomed, and with it the kitchen seemed to wake, not loudly but with warmth. The shadows danced a little. The stone glowed slightly. The scent of ash and promise filled the air. Hannah hadn't come in yet. Layla liked this moment, a breath of solitude before the clatter and rhythm of the day returned. She moved like a ghost between the shelves, gathering flour, water, a bit of salt. She measured by hand, not by numbers but by feel. The bowl was wide and worn, its rim chipped from years of use. She poured the flour in, let it settle like powdered snow, then added the water slowly. One hand stirred, then both kneaded. The dough was soft today. The air was just right. Layla pressed and folded, turned and worked. Her mind wandered only slightly, not far, just enough to remember the smell of bread from her mother's home. Not this bread, not exactly, coarser, heavier, but still warm, still sustaining. Outside the kitchen, the world remained hushed. The sky beyond the narrow window was still that early indigo grey, the kind that whispers of dawn, but does not yet commit. She shaped the loaves, small rounds, pressed with her thumb at the center. She laid them on the cloth, covered them gently, and let them rest. In their stillness they rose. As she cleaned her hands, she heard the soft pad of footsteps, Hannah entering with her usual morning sigh. "It smells like someone remembered." "The salt today," she said, sniffing approvingly. Layla smiled. "Only because I dreamed of flour all night." They shared a quiet laugh. Hannah moved to the corner and began slicing onions, her knife steady, her pace slow. Layla fetched the jug of oil and began brushing the baking stone. They worked together, side by side, in that silent language of long routine. No orders were given, only presence, only rhythm. The loaves went onto the stone just as the first light reached the far wall of the kitchen, a golden finger stretching across the floor. The smell of baking filled the space. Not sweet, but savory, warm and earthy, the scent of effort and patience. Hannah stirred lentils in the corner. Layla rinsed the dates. The morning came into itself minute by minute, as if woken gently by their hands. When the bread was done, Layla removed it carefully, stacking each warm round into a linen-lined basket. The edges were crisp, the centers soft. The kind of bread that filled bellies and calmed tempers. She looked at the stack, then at Hannah. Too much for just the house. "Then it will be a good day," Hannah said. "Extra bread means extra blessing." Layla nodded. She took one round for herself, tore it in half and shared the other piece with Hannah. They sat for a moment on the low bench near the doorway, chewing in silence. No conversation, no ceremony, only the pleasure of fresh bread and a fire well built. Layla closed her eyes just for a moment and let the warmth wash over her, from the hearth, from the food, from the space they had shaped together. The day would grow busy soon. The house would stir, doors would open, voices would rise, water would slosh, cushions would tumble. But this first hour made of dough and fire and quiet breath, belonged only to her, and in it she felt strong. Not because of what she had done, but because of what she had given and received without needing a single word. It was Yasmin who found it, a pale envelope, thick and uneven, folded tightly and tucked just beside the entrance gate, where the morning sun hadn't yet reached, and the dust from the alley settled quietly, as it always did. She picked it up with 2 fingers and turned it over. No seal, no name. Just a single symbol pressed into the edge, a crescent moon cradling a reed pen. Layla was in the courtyard, rinsing the water basin, when Yasmin appeared, waving the envelope like it might fly away. "For the lady," she said, then paused. "Or maybe for someone else." Layla dried her hands and took the letter gently. The symbol was unfamiliar, but the paper, thick, fibrous, a little sweet-smelling, reminded her of something. Alexandria, the scholar. She carried it through the quiet hall to Lady Amina's room and knocked softly. When the lady opened the door, Layla bowed and held out the envelope. Amina took it, her brow briefly knitting as she studied the mark. Then she nodded once. "Thank you." Layla turned to leave, as always, but before she reached the corridor, she heard a quiet, unexpected voice behind her. "Wait." She stopped, turned slightly. Lady Amina didn't meet her eyes. She was still looking at the letter. Her voice, when it came, was thoughtful, not distant, not warm, just open. "You spoke to the scholar, didn't you?" Layla blinked. "Only to serve." Amina's lips curved. "Even so, he noticed you." That was all she said. Layla bowed again, then left. The words echoed in her chest as she moved through the house, brushing cushions, fetching figs, lighting lamps. He noticed you. It should have meant little, a passing glance, a nod, a moment, but somehow it stayed with her, like the scent of perfume long after the wearer has gone. Later that afternoon, while hanging linens to dry on the rooftop, she saw a corner of the envelope poking from the garden bench where Amina often read. She didn't touch it, but she let her eyes linger a moment longer than needed. What did letters hold, really? Ink, paper, thought pressed into symbols, words that tried to catch emotion by the tail. Layla imagined what such a letter might say. Not the real one. She'd never read it, of course, but the kind of letter someone might send after noticing a silence and wanting to answer it. Maybe it would begin, "To the one who moves like breath through a house of stone," or "I write not knowing if these words will be read, but hoping they will be felt." She smiled at herself, half in amusement. She was not a dreamer, not usually, and yet that afternoon everything felt gently loosened. The wind through the linens, the shadows shifting on the floor. Even the dust from the stairway settled differently, as if listening. After supper, Layla returned to her small room. The sky had turned lavender, and the fig tree's shadow stretched long across the courtyard. She lit her lamp early, and for the first time in many weeks, she reached for her own small scroll, the one tucked into the corner of her shelf. Not for chores, not for notes, but for thoughts. She unrolled it and dipped her brush into the ink pot. Her handwriting was plain, untrained, but steady. She didn't write a letter. Not exactly. There was no dear, no from, just a page of thoughts, spilled gently like tea over smooth stone. I saw the mark of the moon cradling a pen. It reminded me of the shape my mother's hands made when folding bread. I think, fave words often, not to speak but to feel. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to receive something with my name written on it. Not for duty, not for task, but just because someone thought of me while the ink was still wet. She paused. Then added, if I ever wrote a letter, I would not need to send it. The writing would be enough. She dried the scroll and tucked it back into its place. Outside, the stars blinked one by one into being. The courtyard grew still again. The lamp glowed softly beside her mat, and somewhere, on a bench near a fading pomegranate tree, a real letter remained, silent, sealed, unread by her. But in her heart something had already been opened. It began with a smell. Not the smoke of bread ovens or the spice dust of the market, not the sharp scent of vinegar from pickled turnips, nor the warm sweetness of stewed figs. No, this was different. It was the smell of wet stone. Layla paused on the threshold of the kitchen, a basket of dates in her arms, and tilted her head. The courtyard, moments before sun-drenched, now bore a hush. The fig leaves, usually restless in the dry breeze, hung still, listening. Then came the sound, soft, scattered, uncertain. The first drops fell not with drama, but with shyness, tapping on the tiles like someone knocking gently at a door they weren't sure they should open. Layla stepped out, just to the edge of the overhang. She looked up. Grey clouds rolled slowly across the sky, heavy and slow, their bellies thick with long-held tears. One drop landed on her cheek, cool, round, and gone in a breath. Rain in Fustat was rare, not absent, not impossible. Just rare, enough to feel like a blessing or a story from another place. From inside, Hannah called, "Cover the linens!" Layla moved quickly, barefoot now, crossing the courtyard in practiced strides. She gathered the cloths from the line. The children's robes, the folded towels, the kitchen rags. She shook the last of the dust from them and ducked back beneath the stone arch just as the rain grew stronger. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't loud, it was something else entirely. Gentle, steady, a kind of music made only for those who stopped, long enough to listen. In the kitchen, the light had shifted. The usual golds and warm browns were now silver and grey-blue. The flames in the hearth glowed like amber. Layla sat near the threshold, the linens beside her, and watched. The water pooled along the edges of the courtyard tiles, tracing old lines between the stones. The fig tree drank greedily, its leaves shiny and dark. A small snail, when had it arrived, crept across the wet stone with impossible slowness. The air smelled clean. Layla felt her chest loosen, her thoughts soften. It was as if the world had taken a long, deep breath. From the sitting room, the children squealed. Amal shouted something about catching rain in her mouth. Tariq laughed, a rare, true laugh that warmed Layla more than the fire behind her. Lady Amina didn't scold them, not this time. Even she perhaps felt that rain was a thing to be heard, not hushed. Layla leaned her head against the stone wall. The coolness of it balanced the warmth in her skin. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep but to feel more deeply. She remembered the village of her childhood, where rain meant muddy paths and laughter, buckets placed under the eaves, steam rising from the earth. Her mother would sing as she stirred lentils, a tune older than the stones, about clouds that kissed the wheat, and a sky that cried only when it remembered its love for the ground. She hummed it now, just barely. Hannah nearby heard. "That one." Again, the older woman said softly. "Your mother's song." Layla nodded. "It's good you remember." "I don't remember all the words. Sometimes the tune is enough." They let the silence return, and the rain answered it. For nearly an hour, the water fell. The city hushed beneath it. Even the market quieted. No shouting, no clanging. Just the soft applause of rain on roof tile, on palm frond, on empty cart. Layla did not rush to begin her next task. Some afternoons were made for pausing, and this one, soft, wet, silver-edged, felt like a prayer. Not the kind spoken aloud, not the kind read from scrolls, but the kind that lives in breath, in stillness, in eyes closed against the gentle rhythm of water touching earth. She would remember this afternoon, not for what she did, but for what she didn't do. She didn't sweep, she didn't stir, she didn't carry, she simply was. And when the rain finally slowed, when the last drops fell, and the courtyard shimmered like a pond of stone and memory, she rose. She took the linens to the rack inside. She checked the corners of the house for damp. She smoothed the cushions the children had left crumpled from watching at the window. The rhythm resumed, but something within her had shifted. Rain had come to Fustat, and in its brief visit, it had washed something in her that even she had not known needed rinsing. By the time evening came, the rain had long passed. The stones of the courtyard still held its cool memory, and the air carried the quiet that follows water, that deep hush, like a whispered lullaby. Layla stood just beneath the archway, her arms wrapped around herself, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders. The sky above, washed clean by the rain, stretched open and wide, an indigo canvas pierced by silver. The stars, clear and sharp, returned one by one, like shy guests invited. Back after a long absence, even the fig tree seemed to shimmer. She had just finished folding the last of the now dry linens. The house had quieted again, the clatter of supper cleaned away, the children already half asleep with stories curled around them like blankets. Tonight, no guest had come, no tea tray was needed, no whisper of distant cities. And yet, something in the air made it feel as if the house were waiting for something, or someone, without knowing exactly what. Layla lit a single oil lamp and placed it on the low step near the door, more for company than necessity. Its glow was warm and round, barely reaching her toes, but she welcomed the flicker. Hannah had gone to her corner early, complaining of knees and muttering about the damp. Layla didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she welcomed it. She stepped into the courtyard fully barefoot. The stones still cool but not cold. She tilted her face toward the stars, eyes half closed, breathing deeply. There was a smell in the air. Not the rain anymore, but what came after. Stone, fig leaf, warm oil, and something faintly floral. The kind of scent you only notice when you stop trying to. She lowered herself slowly onto the stone bench beside the fig tree. Its branches stretched like arms above her, offering shelter without question. For a while, she said nothing. Did nothing. She simply sat. She watched as the stars grew brighter. In the stillness, thoughts began to stir. Not loud, not sharp, but soft, like petals opening in the dark. She thought of her mother, of course, of the song she had hummed during the rain, of the way her hands had always moved with purpose even when there was no one to watch. She thought of her own hands, older now than her mother's had been, when Layla last saw them, and wondered what her mother would say if she saw her daughter like this, sitting beneath a fig tree in a city of stone, dreaming beneath stars she didn't dare touch. And she thought too of the scholar, of the way silence had thickened in the room after he spoke, of how sometimes it was not the words people said, but the space they left around them. That mattered most. She didn't love him. She knew that, but she loved the moment he had created, the space he'd allowed, and the part of herself she had found inside it. That was enough. In the far room, someone turned in their sleep. A door creaked lightly. A cup shifted on a tray, but none of it broke the spell of the night. Layla looked up again. The stars above seemed closer now, not distant ornaments pinned to some unreachable sky, but companions, quiet, constant, unjudging. She remembered something. The scholar had said, "The stars do not burn brighter for kings. They shine the same for the boy on the roof and the woman sweeping the stairs." And so they did. Layla smiled. She closed her eyes and imagined herself not as a servant, not even as a woman, but as part of the house itself. One breath of many, one thread in the cloth. She imagined the house breathing with her, in, out, the fig leaves rustled. The lamp flickered. Somewhere a nightbird sang once, then stopped, and the stars kept shining. Not for her, but with her. The house had fallen into complete stillness. No footsteps, no murmurs, not even the soft creak of wood expanding in the coolness of night. Just the sound of wind passing like breath between the leaves of the fig tree, and the faintest rhythm of water dripping from a rooftop gutter into the jar below. Layla returned to her room slowly, the shawl still around her shoulders, a calm settling into her bones like warm oil. She lit no lamp tonight. The light from the stars, strong after the rain, filtered softly through her lattice window, enough to see the gentle shapes of her world, her mat, her cloth, the water, bowl with a ripple still dancing. She untied her scarf without a sound and folded it on her shelf. Her fingers, still damp from the night air, smoothed the edges of her mat and pillow with quiet care. She lay down and felt the mat cradle her. It had done so for years. It knew her weight, her curl, the way she shifted once before finding stillness. She exhaled, and the world softened. Tonight sleep came quickly, not because she was weary, but because she was ready. Her breath slowed, her thoughts grew quiet, and her dream, when it arrived, was not made of story or fantasy. It was made of breath. Her dream, she was not in a different place. She was here in her own room, on her own mat. But everything was clearer. The clay bowl shimmered slightly like sunlight underwater. The fig tree's shadow, visible through her window, moved with a rhythm that matched her heart. And she, Layla, was both inside her, body and beyond it, present but also watching, as if memory had taken shape and become the air itself. In the dream, she sat up and saw her mother. Not as a vision, not glowing or strange, but simply there, sitting cross-legged at the foot of the mat, her hands resting calmly in her lap. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Her mother's eyes were as Layla remembered, steady, deep, a little tired, but full of light. And her hands, though still, carried the shape of 1,000 meals prepared, 1,000 cloths folded. Layla reached out, not quickly, not desperately, just to touch the edge of her mother's robe. It felt like memory. And comfort. And nothing more dramatic than the presence of someone long missed. They stayed like that, breathing together. And then, very gently, her mother lifted one hand and touched Layla's face. Not to wipe a tear, not to bless or heal, just to say, "You are here, and I see you." Layla closed her eyes in the dream, and when she opened them again, she was alone, but not empty. The room was dark again, the shadows soft, the night quiet, and she was back in her body and breathing steadily, peacefully. Her hand still rested near her cheek, as if to hold what the dream had offered. There were no words, only breath, and the warmth of having touched. Something deep without needing to name it. Sleep folded around her once more, deeper now, no longer dreaming, just resting, held. The first light of morning touched the edge of the courtyard, as gently as a finger on sleeping skin. But Layla was already awake. She had opened her eyes moments before the sun returned. Not startled, not restless, simply awake, as though her body had sensed something quiet shifting in the air. The stars were fading now, dissolving one by one into the growing blue. The fig tree's silhouette stretched high, a black lace pattern against the paling sky. The world was not yet stirring, but it was listening, as though waiting to see how the day would speak its first word. Layla sat up slowly. Her blanket fell to her lap. Her fingers reached instinctively for the cloth from her mother, smoothing it without needing to think. The embroidered corner, a faded rose and 2 leaves, caught a glimmer of new light. She stood and walked barefoot to the water bowl. The water was cool, unmoved by dreams or thoughts. She cupped it in both hands and pressed it to her cheeks, her brow, the back of her neck. Today the water felt more than cleansing. It felt ceremonial, as if she were not just beginning another day but stepping through a doorway. She dressed slowly, tying her sash with care, adjusting the folds of her scarf until it lay just so. She did not rush. There was no need. When she stepped into the courtyard, the light had grown stronger, spilling across the stones in golden puddles. The kitchen was still quiet, Hannah not yet risen, the hearth still asleep. Layla did not go there immediately. Instead, she sat on the bench beside the fig tree. She placed her hands on her knees and breathed in-out. She felt the sun on her face. The first bird's call, hesitant, as if testing the air, as if testing. The wind, soft and sure, brushing past her ear like a whispered secret. And she felt, beneath all of it, the deep stillness of being alive, not performing, not remembering, not preparing, just being. It was a different dawn, and it asked for different thoughts. She thought of the letter, still unread by her but somehow no longer necessary. She thought of the crack in the clay jar, now hidden beneath cloth, still useful, still whole in its way. She thought of the dream, the touch of her mother's hand. And she thought of herself, not as a girl or a maid or a name called softly in hallways, but as a person who had lived every hour of the day before with quiet devotion. The thought brought no pride, just peace. The Pumme house began to stir behind her, a creak of a floorboard. A door pulled softly open, the whisper of a robe brushing stone. But she remained a moment longer, in the sun, in the breath, in the space between the day that was and the day that would be. And when she finally stood, she did not sigh. She simply turned toward the kitchen and walked. Today would bring chores. It would bring fire, and flour and trays, laughter, silence, dust. But it would also bring this, a Layla who now knew that even in repetition, something sacred could be found. That even in a house not her own, she had made a home of small things. That even in days that seemed the same, something inside her had been slowly changing, not loudly but completely, and she carried that knowledge like a quiet jewel beneath her scarf, close to her skin, shining where no one could see. The sky was deep blue again, not the bold blue of midday, nor the lavender hush of dusk. It was that in-between blue, where evening lingers without declaring itself, and the day holds its breath before giving in to night. The house was quiet once more. The fire in the kitchen had been doused. The dishes stacked, the towels hung neatly on their pegs. The children, long since tucked in, breathed in rhythm beneath their blankets. Hannah had retired without fuss, her knees wrapped in cloth, and her sigh folded into the straw mattress. And Layla stood in the courtyard one last time. She leaned lightly against the fig tree, her hand resting on its familiar bark. The breeze moved through its branches with a rustle like an old story retold. Above, a single star had emerged, not the brightest but the first. It had been a day like all others, but also it hadn't. Because today, Layla had seen herself differently. Not in a mirror, not in words spoken aloud, but in the stillness between moments, in the way she paused by the tree, in the way she lingered over the stitching in the children's robes, in the way she felt the weight of the bread dough in her hands and knew it would rise, not just because it always had, but because she knew how to make it rise. She had, over time, become the rhythm of the house, and yet she remained Layla, a woman who dreamed with her eyes open, who folded stories into silence, who never wrote letters but knew how to read the wind. As she turned to leave the courtyard, her hand grazed the edge of the water basin. It was nearly empty now, but the bottom still shimmered with the last of the evening light. She cupped her hand into it, touched it to her forehead, her chest, not from habit, but from choice, a quiet blessing for the end of the day. When she reached her room, it was as she'd left it, her mat waiting, the cloth folded, the bowl clean. Her world, and was small, whole hers. She lit the lamp, then changed her mind and let the stars be her light. She sat for a while. No scroll tonight, no words needed. She simply looked up at the sky through the slatted window and breathed, and as the night deepened, she thought not of what would come tomorrow, nor of the years before. She thought only of now, of the softness in her limbs, of the quiet pulse in her wrist, of the breath that moved in and out like the tide of something ancient and kind. And she knew this day would not be remembered by anyone but her. There would be no record of it, no celebration, no story told in the market. But it was her day, fully lived, gently held, and that was enough. She lay down. The mat welcomed her. The shadows wrapped around her, and with a final breath, steady, slow, sure, Layla let the day end, not with farewell but with continuation.